There is a type of person who knows you are lying before you finish your sentence. Not because they are suspicious, not because they are paranoid, because their nervous system was wired through years of experience to read human beings at a level that science is only beginning to understand. And the terrifying part is, they almost never tell you they know. You have probably met one. Maybe you are one. And if you are, there is something important you need to hear. Something nobody ever told you about why your life has felt the way it has. Because what most people call sensitivity, neuroscience is now calling something else entirely. And what you are about to find out will completely change how you see yourself and how you see the people around you. But first, I need to tell you about a study that most people have never heard of. Researchers at the University of California gave participants photographs of strangers' eyes, only the eyes, nothing else, and asked them to identify what emotion the person was feeling. Most people could do it, but a specific subset of participants scored so accurately, so consistently, that the researchers initially thought there was a flaw in their data. These individuals were not trained psychologists. They were not detectives. They were ordinary people with one unusual thing in common. They had all described themselves as emotionally sensitive their entire lives. The researchers called what these people had a form of emotional pattern detection. But here is what they did not fully explain, and I will get to that at the end of this video, because what causes this ability, and what it does to the person who has it, is far darker and far more powerful than anyone ever talks about. Stay with me, because the answer to why this happens is not what you expect. And once you hear it, you will never see your own reactions the same way again. Let's start with something that happens in the human body faster than thought. Before you consciously decide how you feel about someone, your nervous system has already made a judgment. Research in social neuroscience shows that the brain processes the emotional content of a human face in less than 33 milliseconds. That is 3 times faster than the blink of an eye. Long before you can form the thought, "I don't trust this person," your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, has already flagged the interaction. For most people, that signal gets drowned out by social politeness, by the desire to seem reasonable, by the fear of being wrong. But in certain individuals, that signal doesn't get buried. It gets amplified. And those individuals are not broken. They are not anxious. Their brain is functioning exactly the way a survival machine should function. They have just never been given the language to understand what is happening inside them. This is the first thing you need to understand about people with high emotional sensitivity. They are not reacting emotionally. They are processing data. Every slight change in vocal tone, every forced pause before an answer, every smile that reaches the mouth but not the muscles around the eyes. These are not impressions. These are physical signals, measurable, real, carrying information. And a highly aware person absorbs all of it simultaneously, without trying, without effort, and in many cases, without realizing it is even happening. There is a word for this in behavioral science: leakage. Emotional leakage is the involuntary release of true emotional states through the body, through micro-movements, through voice pitch, through breathing rhythm, through postural shifts that happen in fractions of a second. Trained FBI negotiators spend years learning to detect leakage. Some therapists and investigators develop this skill through practice over decades, but highly aware empaths develop it automatically, not because they chose to, but because they had to. And that reason, the reason they had to, is where this story gets both darker and more important than most people realize. I told you I would explain what causes this level of detection, what the researchers didn't say. We are getting there, but to understand it, you first need to understand what happens to a nervous system under prolonged emotional uncertainty. Imagine growing up in an environment where the emotional weather changed without warning, where a parent's mood could shift from warm to dangerous in minutes, where silence had different meanings on different days, and reading those meanings correctly was not an intellectual exercise, it was a survival skill. The child in that environment does not have the luxury of taking people at face value. They learn to scan. They learn to read the space between words. They learn to track breathing, footsteps, facial tension, door sounds, the weight of a pause. And over years of that kind of training, the brain rewires itself. The threat detection system becomes extraordinarily refined. Pattern recognition becomes unconscious and automatic. And the nervous system, which was designed to relax after danger passes, never fully gets the chance to. It stays alert. It stays scanning. It stays ready, even decades later, in safe environments, with people who mean no harm, because the brain does not forget what it learned to survive. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, but that word makes it sound like a problem. What it actually is a finely calibrated human intelligence system that was built by necessity. And here is the part that changes everything. The people who carry this system inside them often have no idea how much they are actually perceiving. They just know something feels off. They just know they sense things others miss. And they spend years, sometimes entire lifetimes, being told they are imagining it, that they are too sensitive, that they are overreacting, until the truth surfaces. The lie is exposed. The pattern repeats. The manipulation becomes undeniable. And they realize, quietly, that they were right the entire time. Their nervous system knew, long before their conscious mind could prove it. This is what makes highly aware empaths both extraordinary and exhausted, because there is a cost to processing this much emotional information constantly. Neuroscientists studying high-sensitivity individuals have found significantly elevated activation in regions of the brain associated with empathy processing, awareness of others' mental states, and emotional memory. In simple terms, their brain is working harder than average all the time, even at rest. And just like any system running at maximum capacity around the clock, it eventually shows the strain. The exhaustion is not laziness. The need for solitude is not antisocial. The overwhelm in crowds is not weakness. It is a high-performance system that was never designed to run at full output continuously. And when highly aware people do not understand this about themselves, they do the worst thing possible. They push through. They keep absorbing. They keep giving. They keep showing up fully while their nervous system quietly burns through its reserves, until the day comes when they cannot get out of bed, and they do not know why. Until the anxiety becomes chronic and the doctors find nothing physically wrong. Until the relationships that once felt meaningful start to feel like slow drains on something they cannot afford to lose anymore. And here is where the story shifts. Because everything I just described, that exhaustion, that hypervigilance, that decades-long overgiving, does something to a person. Something that most people on the outside would never see coming. It transforms them. Not in the way self-help books describe transformation, some sudden motivational awakening after a 20-minute morning routine. The transformation that happens inside a highly aware empath after enough pain is neurological. It is slow. It is quiet. And once it begins, it cannot be reversed. Because the brain that has spent years absorbing betrayal, manipulation, and emotional exploitation does not simply continue being naive. It learns. It updates. It begins building a new operating system out of lived pattern recognition. And that new system is far more sophisticated and far less forgiving than the one that came before it. Here is how the behavioral shift happens. Early in life, most highly sensitive people operate from a place of assumed goodness. They give others the benefit of the doubt, not because they are foolish, but because empathy, at its core, is the act of extending emotional generosity toward another person. They listen to what is said rather than watching what is done. They forgive inconsistencies because they can feel the pain behind them. They stay in difficult situations long past the point a less sensitive person would leave, because their empathy extends even toward the person who is hurting them. And manipulative individuals, whether consciously or not, recognize this quality almost instantly. Because what makes someone easy to emotionally exploit is not stupidity. It is an open nervous system with no perimeter protection. But every betrayal teaches the brain something. Every time the empath trusted the words and not the behavior, and was hurt for it, the brain logs that. Every time they ignored that feeling in their chest because someone told them they were imagining things, and then months later the truth proved them right, the brain logs that too. And over time, something begins to change in how the highly aware empath processes new social information. They stop leading with emotional openness. They begin with observation. They stop trusting charm. They start tracking consistency. They stop listening for what people say they will do. They start watching what people actually do when no one is supposed to be paying attention. Psychologists who study interpersonal perception have a term for this kind of high-accuracy social judgment: thin slicing. It refers to the brain's ability to make remarkably accurate assessments of a person or situation from a very brief slice of behavioral information. Research found that people watching a 3-second clip of a teacher interacting with students could predict that teacher's end-of-year evaluations with striking accuracy, better than students who had spent an entire semester in the class. 3 seconds. The brain was processing behavioral patterns at a speed that conscious analysis cannot match. And what the research suggests is that thin slicing accuracy improves dramatically with emotional experience. The more emotional data a person has processed, especially painful data, the more refined their pattern detection becomes. This is what happens inside a highly aware empath after years of emotional experience. Their thin slicing becomes almost frightening in its precision. They do not need 6 months to know someone is hiding something. They do not need 3 red flags to feel unsafe. Their nervous system, honed by years of emotional data, makes that call in the first interaction, often in the first minute. And most of the time, they're right. Not because they're psychic, because they're running a pattern recognition system that has been trained on more emotional data than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Now, remember that study I mentioned at the beginning, the one where certain people read emotional states from photographs of eyes with almost impossible accuracy? I told you the researchers did not fully explain what caused it. Here is what the data points toward. The individuals who scored highest were not simply born with exceptional empathy. When their backgrounds were examined more closely, a disproportionate number of them had experienced emotionally unpredictable or difficult early environments that would require exactly the kind of constant emotional scanning we have been describing. Their accuracy was not a gift they were handed. It was a skill their nervous system built to survive. And that changes everything about how we should think about sensitivity, because it means emotional awareness is not a personality quirk. It is, in many cases, an adaptive intelligence that was earned through experience most people would not wish on anyone. And here is the consequence of carrying that intelligence. When a highly aware empath reaches the turning point, when they finally stop dismissing their own perceptions and start trusting what their nervous system has been telling them for years, the people who once depended on their emotional generosity notice the change immediately, and they do not like it. Because the empath who no longer ignores inconsistencies is not as easy to mislead. The empath who no longer explains away red flags is not as easy to keep in unhealthy dynamics. The empath who has stopped prioritizing everyone else's comfort above their own survival is not the same resource they once were. And so they get a new label: cold, distant, changed, difficult. And every single one of those labels is simply the reaction of someone who benefited from the empath's previous lack of boundaries, and now has to face a world where that access is no longer freely given. But let's talk about what actually happens inside the empath during this transformation, because it is one of the least discussed aspects of emotional development in psychology. When a person who processes emotion deeply goes through enough relational pain and finally begins reducing their exposure to emotional chaos, something measurable happens in the brain. Cortisol levels begin to stabilize. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, planning, and emotional regulation, begins recovering function that chronic stress had been suppressing. Cognitive clarity returns. The mental fog that many empaths carry for years and attribute to anxiety or depression begins to lift. Not because their external life necessarily improved, but because their nervous system stopped being weaponized by proximity to emotional instability. Research on stress neuroscience is clear on this. Reducing exposure to chronic, unpredictable stress allows the brain to shift out of survival mode and into a far more sophisticated cognitive state. A state where long-term thinking becomes possible again, where creativity returns, where the empath's extraordinary perceptual abilities stop being used purely for threat detection and begin being applied to everything else, to understanding, to creation, to connection on terms they have chosen. This is the version of the highly aware empath that almost no one talks about. Not the suffering version, not the exhausted, over-giving, self-erasing version. The version that exists on the other side of the transformation. The person who has learned, through direct experience, exactly how human manipulation operates, because it was used on them. The person who can read the emotional architecture of a situation before most people have even processed what is happening. The person who no longer needs external validation because they have developed an internal perceptual framework that they have tested against reality over and over and found to be reliable. That person is not soft. That person is not fragile. That person is one of the most socially intelligent human beings in the room, and they are almost certainly the quietest one there. There is research in social psychology on what happens to highly sensitive individuals who develop strong emotional boundaries. Studies show they tend to score exceptionally high in interpersonal accuracy, the ability to correctly read others' intentions and emotional states. They tend to develop unusually strong moral clarity, a precise sense of what they will and will not accept, because their nervous system communicates boundary violations in a way less sensitive people simply do not experience. They tend to form fewer, deeper relationships, not because they are unable to connect, but because their perceptual system makes shallow connection feel like a kind of sensory pollution. And they tend to demonstrate what researchers call post-traumatic growth, measurable increases in psychological strength, purpose, and emotional complexity that emerge specifically from having navigated deep suffering and survived it. None of this is mystical. None of this is spiritual language dressed up in psychology. This is the documented outcome of a nervous system that was pushed to its limits and discovered, in the process, what it was actually capable of. But there is one final piece of this story. One thing that most people, even highly aware empaths themselves, tend to misunderstand about this entire process, and it might be the most important thing. The transformation I have been describing, the shift from exhausted overgiver to perceptually powerful, boundaried, emotionally precise individual, does not require suffering to continue. That is the part the pain teaches incorrectly. Many empaths, after years of difficult experience, come to associate depth of feeling with depth of pain. They begin to unconsciously seek out emotionally intense environments because intensity is what they have learned to associate with meaning. The chaos feels familiar. The unpredictability feels like passion. The people who keep them emotionally activated feel like the only ones worth being around. And this is the trap that catches even the most aware empaths, because it turns their greatest strength, their capacity for deep emotional engagement, into a mechanism that keeps drawing them back toward the environments that damage them most. The final evolution of a highly aware empath is not becoming emotionally numb. It is not building walls so high that nothing gets through. It is learning, and this is genuinely difficult, to distinguish between emotional intensity and emotional safety. Because they feel completely different to the undeveloped nervous system. Intensity is loud, addictive, consuming. Safety is quiet, consistent, and to a nervous system trained on chaos, it can initially feel almost boring. But safety is where the empath's gifts finally get to function without self-destruction. Safety is where the pattern recognition becomes wisdom instead of survival. Safety is where the emotional depth, instead of being poured endlessly into people who drain it, gets directed toward things that grow, toward work, toward relationships, toward creative output that reflects the full complexity of what this person actually perceives and understands. Highly aware empaths who reach this stage are not people who stop feeling deeply. They are people who finally learn to feel selectively, who learn that their emotional attention is one of the most powerful things they possess, and that where they choose to direct it will determine everything about the quality of their life. They become fiercely protective of their peace, not because they gave up, because they finally understand what their peace is worth. And this brings us back to the beginning, to that study, to those people who could read a stranger's emotional state from a photograph of their eyes alone with near impossible accuracy. What made them extraordinary was not just what they could see, it was what they had survived in order to learn to see it. Their perception was not a random gift, It was the evidence of a human being who had